Folks, let's get started. So it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Katie Skinner to deliver today's seminar as well. We have the winter seminar series. So Professor Skinner is assistant professor in the Department of Robotics, also has an appointment in the department here at the University of and she's an expert in robotics, AI, and autonomy. Professor Skinner is a recipient of several awards as listed. The dataset Career Award, the ONR Young Investigator Award, and the IEEE Robotics Letters Best Paper Award. And I'm really looking forward to your talk today on machine learning for shipwreck detection and mapping with marine robotic platforms.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be here. I'm excited to talk to you about my group's work. So marine robotics is a really exciting field. Hopefully some of you are aware already. Marine robots enable us to explore coastal environments, Great Lakes, and the deepest parts of our ocean. Of course, if you worked in this field, you know that there's a lot of challenges still with deploying robots in marine environments, including cost, sometimes dangerous operating conditions, uncertain weather conditions. And we also have limited availability of things that we rely on land, like GPS and Wi-Fi. We don't have available widely underwater. So there's a lot of challenges in this field, but that's what makes it really exciting for research. My group mainly focuses on perception and machine learning for marine robotic systems. So I'll talk a little bit about our work in that area today. So today, most of the work I'm talking about, we've been using autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs. AUVs are widely used now for many applications. They're very maneuverable, cost-effective, and they can travel relatively long ranges on battery power. As I mentioned, there's no GPS or Wi-Fi available underwater, so we have very limited communication with these vehicles when they are underwater. And when we deploy sensors on AUVs, things like cameras that we're used to using in robotics on land is challenged underwater because we only have camera imagery at very short ranges to the system. And also mission duration is limited by onboard battery. For these IVR AUVs we work with, we get about 8 hours of continuous operation at our operating speed. So one of the sensors that I'll be talking a lot about today is the side scan sonar. So side scan sonar, if you can see on the AUV, it's up in the front there. There's actually a lens, one on each side of the vehicle, and it scans out to either side of the vehicle. So when you're looking at the side scan image, the black track or the nadir is actually the trajectory of the vehicle, and then the image on either side is on the left and right hand side of the vehicle from each lens. We can get a pretty long range on either side of the vehicle from side scan sonar. So I think for these surveys, we're about 130 meters on either side. So this is a pretty large range for us. And high-end side scan sonar can be pretty high resolution with up to 2 centimeters at best. And they are small enough to be integrated on a wide range of vehicles. So side scan sonar is pretty unique. So I would say, if you haven't seen it before, it can take a little bit getting used to. You can see that the geometry I talked about, where the observation or the images returns are mainly on the left and right hand side of the vehicle. We don't have any observations directly underneath the vehicle, and that's because of the side scan geometry. And we also get some pretty interesting effects like the shipwreck here. You can see some pretty extreme shadowing effects, and that is related to the relief from the seafloor for that object. We can't make direct measurements of elevation from the side scan image itself. We have an elevation ambiguity, but we do have some cues as to the height of things from the bottom based on these shadowing effects, for example. But still, interpreting side scan sonar is pretty challenging for non-experts. As I mentioned, the shadows, but there's other effects like distortions, which can come from vehicle motion. It is also, in general, still expensive and difficult to capture rare objects such as shipwrecks, right? It's a big ocean. And there can be poor generalization in the field because there's a very wide range of appearance of both objects and of sonar image quality, depending on the parameters that we have when we capture the images. So in general, we usually rely on expert knowledge for interpretation of side scan sonar. If we're doing something like target detection or shipwreck detection, we work directly with marine archaeologists up at Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, who are experts in interpreting side scan sonar, and they're experts at the sites, right? They've done multiple dives to these sites, so they really know what they're
Question.
visualizing. Yes.
Sorry, but what is the quantity being put?
So this is the acoustic intensity. Yeah. Yeah, so it can be affected by things like material properties as well. So in our data set, you'll see, we image wooden ships, metal ships, steel ships. So the return can be affected as well. So yeah, in general, we rely on experts to interpret side scan imagery. Of course, sometimes when we have really nice high resolution images, if I asked you all to figure out where the ship is in this image, I would think, hopefully you'd all figure it out on your own. It can get a little trickier. As I said, we have distortion effects. This survey might have been maybe too close to the surface where we had some wave interaction. But then other times it can be actually quite hard for non-experts. So this terrain is a little bit more complex. There's a lot more relief on the natural terrain itself. So maybe if I gave you a little bit of time, you could find it. But here is the wreck here. You can see this wreck isn't as intact as the other ones, so that makes it more challenging. It's pretty widely dispersed. So the question we wanted to ask here is, instead of relying on experts to manually sift through all of the sonar data that we collect with our robots, can we actually teach the robots to automatically detect shipwrecks themselves? So could we send a robot out into the field, have it collect data, come back, tell us what it found? So this led to a project we started in 2021. This was funded by NOAA Ocean Exploration. And the goal of this project was to focus on machine learning for automated detection of shipwreck sites. The first task was to develop machine learning tools to do this, and then to enable robots to take the detections that we had and perform autonomous close range surveys for imaging, inspection of the shipwreck sites. And lastly, we also had this goal to increase accessibility of data collected for shipwreck detection to really foster more innovation in machine learning for ocean exploration applications. So I'll talk about this work in a bit more detail. So the first work that we focused on is called STARS, or shipwreck segmentation without real examples. So what we found is that prior work focusing on this problem really relied on supervised learning for training machine learning models. What that means is you need a large amount of training data, like with your examples of your shipwrecks or objects that you care about, and you train a network to look at the training data, detect shipwrecks from labels that you have as ground truth, and then at test time, they can repeat that task and try to detect shipwrecks in new data that they haven't seen during training. There has been prior work that adapted imaging segmentation methods to side scan sonar specifically, thinking about things like shadowing effects and how you can leverage cues from those kind of unique characteristics. But in general, it really relied on manually labeled real data. So one thing we found as a challenge for this application is that while we have a lot of publicly available data from side scan sonar surveys, there are very few examples of real shipwreck sites and very few examples that are labeled for us in a nice way for machine learning tasks. So actually the first year of this project, we kind of reframed the question here. Can we learn to detect shipwrecks without seeing any real examples during training, right? This would be the scenario where you have an object that you don't have a lot of examples of in the data. These are rare objects that maybe don't occur regularly in your data collection. So this led us to develop our network STARS, which performs zero-shot sim-to-real transfers for segmentation of shipwrecks. So zero-shot means that without seeing any real examples during training, it can directly, during test time, detect shipwreck sites. Sim-to-real, I'll talk a little bit more about in detail, but there's a big trend in robotics right now to rely on simulated data to augment training data sets. Simulated environments can be really valuable because you can generate a lot of data and you essentially get your labels for free, right? Because the environment knows where the ships are because we put them there. So you get your labels for free. It's a very cheap way to augment your training data. The challenge, of course, is that no matter how realistic your simulator is, you're always going to have the sim-to-real gap, right? So there's going to be some gap in how the simulated data looks and the distribution of real data, and that can lead to poor performance at test time. So we were inspired by anomaly detection frameworks to address this challenge. What that means is we thought of the problem as a targeted anomaly detection task, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I show the network. But just to give an overview for training, we have a synthetic data generation pipeline. We use real terrain and augment them with simulated ships. So we do have some real terrain data there. And our network has two branches that ultimately take in the sonar image and learn to predict the segment. So again, during training, there's no real examples of shipwrecks, but there is examples of real terrain that we are augmenting with the simulated shipwrecks on top. And then at test time, we can give the network a side scan sonar image that it's never seen before with shipwreck examples, and it can learn to segment out the shipwrecks. And we show that this is better than alternative methods. So first, talking about our synthetic data set, we made this in Blender for side scan sonar simulation. It allowed us to randomize terrain, ship type, orientation, and we also looked at fracturing the ships in the sonar data. You'll see that our data is not super realistic, and that wasn't our goal. Our goal was to be able to generate a lot of data, see a lot of variety of different scenarios, not to focus on photorealism. I think that for sim to real, the performance improvements will need to come from both directions, right? Making our simulators more realistic, but also developing machine learning models that can leverage simulated data for testing on real data. So again, we get our ground truth labels for free, which is our shipwreck segmentation. And this is the data set that we use for training our network. So STARS has two main components. The first is this anomaly branch. So the anomaly branch is the student teacher network. And again, it's inspired by anomaly detection frameworks. And what it does is it sees a lot of examples of real terrain with and without ships and simulated ships, and it tries to essentially detect anomalies in the terrain, right? So if you see a lot of examples of real terrain, the anomaly detection is hopefully looking for something that looks different than that. But in our case, it's targeted because we have some simulated examples of shipwrecks. We also have a proxy task, which is this deformation branch. So proxy tasks can be really useful in machine learning. Basically, instead of focusing on the task that we care about, segmentation, we also incorporate learning for another related problem. In our case, it was deformation prediction. So we have the network try to learn for the fragmented ships how to put it back together. And what that does is it helps the network learn features that it needs to pay attention to for that deformation prediction problem, right? And hopefully those features are things that are also useful for the segmentation problem. So those are kind of the two main components for our network, and ultimately we're performing segmentation. So we compared our network to state-of-the-art anomaly detection, segmentation frameworks. All of these networks were trained without access to the real ships, so they either have the simulated data or only the terrain data for training, depending on the network type. And we show that our network does outperform these alternative methods when we don't have access to real examples during training. But to show some qualitative results that are a little easier to interpret. So the left is the input side scan sonar image. Next to that is the ground truth, which is hand labeled with help from marine archaeologists that we work with. And then our network stars. So you can see we do pretty well considering none of these methods have access to real examples of shipwrecks during training. I think this is pretty impressive for performing that zero shot segmentation problem. But there's of course still some areas for improvement. So one of the things that we did during data collection was we wanted to capture examples of things that are really challenging for networks to distinguish from shipwrecks themselves, right? So these are kind of negative examples. So on the bottom row, you see an artificial reef. This is, a series of rocks or maybe concrete pillars that are placed in the environment. And this is a really challenging one because you can see they're placed in kind of a linear formation. So, if the network is trained to detect ship, not ship, this is something that is really challenging for it to say is not a ship because of the training data that it has seen so far. So one of the areas for future work is to try to improve performance for these challenging cases where we have these kind of negative examples. But still in year 2, it was really exciting. We were able to go back with our trained network. And again, it hasn't seen any real examples of shipwrecks, but then out in the field, it was able to give us segmentations of new shipwreck sites that we did not visit in year 1. You'll notice these segmentations are a little bit larger than the shipwreck itself. The reason for that is because that is the input that we use for the robotics application for close range inspection, which I'll talk about in a little bit more. But it was really exciting to be able to go out on the boat, go to new sites that we hadn't seen before, and we could run our methods on a GPU laptop right on the boat. So we'd get the robot back, offload the data, and within 5 minutes, we could see detections of shipwreck sites. So really exciting. I think there's a lot of potential here for this type of work and for machine learning in general to really speed up the pipeline for detection of objects in marine environments. Okay, so one of the other goals I mentioned was to increase data accessibility for these tasks. By the second year, we had visited quite a few shipwreck sites. So we used this to compile a new data set called AI for Shipwrecks. And this work, this data set is really meant for encouraging new innovation in machine learning for shipwreck segmentation. So just to give kind of an overview of our field site, all of this work has been conducted in Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. If you haven't been up there, I really recommend it. This is in Alpena or Northeast Michigan in Lake Huron. And there is the National Marine Sanctuary, which is jointly run by NOAA and the Michigan State Department. It's a really, really unique place up there. So there's 100 known shipwreck sites and 100 suspected shipwreck sites. And there's a museum up there, and you can go on a glass boat tour. There's a lot to see if you go up to Thunder Bay. So it's a really unique place for us to carry out this work, of course, because we have so many known shipwreck sites in such a small area. So our data collection process looks something like this, and I'll go through each of these steps individually. But essentially, first we carry out pre-planned lawnmower paths to deploy our robot, collect our sonar data, and then that sonar data is input into the network for segmentation. So we use mainly lawnmower surveys. There's a couple of different types of surveys, but I just want to point out that even though we're working on autonomous underwater vehicles, the state of practice is still to use pre-planned surveys for our missions, right? So many times we do these lawnmower surveys, kind of like you're mowing the lawn. The survey area where we're actually underwater is that purple box. And that is because we need to actually surface on either end of the lawnmower to get GPS lock. So as I mentioned, we don't have GPS underwater. So we do have some drift from our odometry estimate. While we're underwater, we come up to the surface to correct that drift and go back underwater. So we are carrying out these lawnmower surveys. When we worked on these field expeditions, we were working really closely with the marine archaeologists in Thunder Bay to determine the survey parameters. So we pick things like the survey area, spacing between the legs so that we have enough overlap of our sonar images, also our sonar swath width, which we need to decide based on the altitude or depth of the survey. So again, we worked really closely with archaeologists to make sure we wouldn't interrupt any of the sites. They know exactly where all of the buoys are placed. It's pretty incredible, the knowledge that they have about these sites. So once we have our pre-planned mission loaded onto the vehicle, we deploy it. So these were day trips out on the boat, and we would typically deploy the AUV for about an hour at a time, so not too long of missions. And then when we get the vehicles back, we would take a look at the data, and this is kind of what we see. So this is barge number 1, more familiarly called chicken barge because it had a bunch of chickens on board when it sank that all floated to shore. So it's a fun one that we liked to put. And you can see it's a really nice survey or shipwreck to survey as well because it's very high resolution. It's a good survey depth for us, and it's a large site that you can actually see a lot of the debris sitting on top. These are called waterfall images. So every line is essentially the ping on either side of the vehicle just being accumulated as the vehicle is moving along its track.
Is this real time? Your software is running on the boat real time and visualizing it?
So it's not real time. So we get the data off the vehicle first, and then this is it's a free software, but it's like a proprietary format. And it does take a little while to process. And it is doing some pre-processing for us too. So yeah, that was one thing that we have found that does have a big impact, is how that pre-processing is done for your training versus test data is really important. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is one thing that is interesting for the future as well, is how do you actually do this on board the vehicle? Because right now we're doing things offline. So in summary, for the 2 years, about 5 weeks of data collection, we saw 29 different sites. The site depths vary. The deepest one was about 80 meters. And we had a pretty wide range of site lengths. So that's the shipwreck length itself. And there are a couple different materials for the shipwrecks and a couple different terrain types, although there isn't too much variety in terrain in this region. So once we had all of our data collected, our goal was to benchmark with this large data set that we have now, supervised learning methods. So what that means, again, is taking some input sonar image and learning to translate that to a semantic segmentation, which is a pixel-wise label. So we label every pixel shipwreck, not shipwreck. Luckily, there are some tools to do this, but I will still say thank you to my graduate students who sat down and got this work done. Yep.
Does the cropped input image have to be manually selected, or does the ML go through like all the series of images and do the analysis for each one?
So we had to come up with kind of an automated cropping method. So all of the images, when we export them from the Discover software, are the same width. I think it's like 1728 pixels. So that's the same width in pixel space, not the same width in meters, right? Because they're all different swath widths. So there is some variety in actually the like metric scale of each of the images. But yeah, we came up with a way to essentially post-process these images. So we did a strided cropping where they're now square images that are being input into the networks. And we did end up, I think, scaling them down to 512 by 512, just because some of the networks that we tested only took that resolution. So we did some scaling as well. But yeah, this is another area that is, or another kind of feature that is important to pay attention to, because it can impact results. How do you do this cropping? And then just going back to the labeling real quick. So we, again, worked with the marine archaeologists to label and confirm our labels. But we ended up doing segmentations for the main shipwreck. And then you can see in red, we also labeled all of the individual debris objects that were around the ship. And we also have the mooring buoys as well, just because they're, not natural features. So maybe good to have in mind for later. But we're considering anything that is red and yellow here to be part of the shipwreck. One of the challenges we had is, even though we saw 29 different sites, that's still not a very large sample size of shipwreck types for machine learning methods, right? If you've heard of like ImageNet for image classification, it's like millions of images. So it's still a relatively small size. And what we found is that the training and test selection really had a big impact on results, right? If you're only going to train on really large steel ships that are all intact, you're not going to do well on the wooden ships that are really dispersed. So what we ended up doing for our experiments was we split the train and test site to evenly distribute for a couple of features that we just kind of experimentally found were important. But I think this, again, is something that could really use some interesting, more investigation in the future. The features we selected were wreck conditions. So we sat down with the archaeologists. They came up with 8 different classes of wreck conditions. So things like intact all the way to not intact. So we have 8 different classes there that they sorted into. Sonar image quality, because some of the images have really high distortion that impacted results. And then also terrain type. Some of the terrain here is very smooth sand. Some has some limestone texture, and others had some really large visual features, not necessarily changes in elevation, but they did impact results. So you can see the large features on the bottom right. So when we made our train test split, we kind of labeled all the images by these categories as well. And then we made sure that the train and test was evenly distributed so that they had, relatively the same distribution for these features for training and testing. So this is just an overview of our site selection. So all of these sites are sites that we visited, and the sites in yellow are training, sites in red are testing, and then we had a couple of surveys that were just terrain with no shipwreck sites as well, just so that we could increase the amount of terrain data that we had. So we performed benchmarking experiments on this data. We have a couple more experiments in the paper, but here's just an overview of results. So again, this is supervised segmentation. So they do see the labels, the networks do see the labels during training. So I think they get a bit more fine detail than the previous networks that we saw. The network SOD on the left here did the best. So this is kind of our initial benchmarking experiments just to provide a resource for the community on to normalize the testing scheme here for this task. And we released the data set and the code available to perform the benchmarking tests on our lab website. So if you're interested in using this data, right now we've provided the PNG images from the sonar surveys, but we will provide the raw sonar surveys as well. We're working on uploading them to NOAA's archive base right now. So hopefully that will be a useful resource for the community. Okay, so how can we use some of these detections once we have them? This brings us to kind of the last part of our project, going from search to survey. So our goal on the machine learning side was to take input sonar images, output a detection mask. As I mentioned, the detections that we ended up needing for the autonomous surveying team were actually a little bit different than what we get from the pixel-wise segmentation. So what they really need is a region that gives the full extent of the area that they need to survey. And they use that to automatically plan a lawnmower path within that region so that they can cover the full site. So we expanded our segmentations just to capture all of the different segmented parts of the site, which could include things like those wooden beams lying off the side. And this was the path that the vehicles with the imaging sensors went to for autonomous surveys. So we collaborated with Louisiana State University, Professor Karina Barbelata, who actually did her postdoc in the name department here. These are their two robots, ROV Bruce and ROV Dory. There was a Nemo as well, but he did not make it the second trip. So these are vehicles that are modified from Blue ROV, which is made by Blue Robotics. If you've ever seen those vehicles, we sometimes test ours in MHL. They're kind of off-the-shelf vehicles that you can buy and really modify yourself. These vehicles were modified, or the Dory vehicle was modified to have stereo cameras, which is two cameras facing downward. Stereo cameras just give you depth perception, like your eyes. So this is really useful for downstream tasks. Bruce was really used more for surveying the sites independently with an ROV pilot, but it does also have a ping 360 sonar from Blue Robotics. And a monocular, both of them have monocular cameras, which are just for the pilots to be able to see where they're going. So these are some of our deployments of these remotely operated vehicles for our imaging surveys. I just like to plug this because tether management is really hard, so that's always my task. And the LSU team did a really nice job with their data collection. So this is actually from, I think, one of the first autonomous surveys that we did. It'll play, hopefully not too loud. Yeah, so this is a survey of the Monahans shipwreck site. That is one of the shallow water sites in the area, but I think it's a pretty cool site because there's a lot of interesting features. As the vehicle moves further, you'll see one of the boilers that is still intact as well. So for our imaging surveys, I mentioned we have to be pretty close range for capturing imagery. That's because of the image degradations that we see underwater. So what's leading to these blue or green watercolors is due to attenuation, backscattering, essentially water column effects on underwater image formation. So we typically need to be about 2 to 4 meters from the objects that we're surveying to carry out these surveys and get useful images. So this is a pretty challenging task for autonomy to be so close to an object that we don't really know very well what it looks like. We mainly have the bounding box area. But these images can be really important for downstream tasks. So once we have collected all of the images, we can use these images to compute a 3D model. So the 3D models are really useful for the archaeologists to both investigate the site further on land, but also to go back and look through year after year how the site has changed from kind of a bird's eye view. So typically the archaeologists perform diving surveys regularly of these sites, capture images with like a DSLR camera, build a 3D model, and kind of go through this manual process. Our goal is really to automate that full pipeline to be able to send a robot out, collect images from a survey, and not only do that in an automated way so that it's faster for the actual survey, but do it in a repeatable way, right? Because the vehicle we can program to get the same survey trajectory year after year versus a human diver that is going to have more variation in their survey trajectories. So this was the 3D model of that Monahansett shipwreck site. You can see a couple of the features like the boiler off to the right there. So this is a pretty nice result. I would say not all of our sites look like this that we got images from. And in general, 3D reconstruction is still a really challenging task underwater. So this model was created offline. It took actually several days on a high-end computer to compute this 3D model. And you can see we didn't do color correction, so there is some distorted color. There are things we can do that are simple to somewhat correct that. But it's also can be prone to holes and sparsity. So again, this model is pretty good. There's a couple of artifacts that I can see, maybe like this one right here. It's kind of like a ghost artifact. But in general, for 3D modeling underwater, we still have a lot of challenges like sparsity and artifacts in our models that usually require us to do a lot of post-processing as well, which just adds more time. So the work that we're doing now is actually working to improve this pipeline. So we're moving towards real-time dense mapping underwater. And this is work that we've been kind of newly developing, and we'll go back and test starting this summer on some of these shipwreck sites. So I'll talk a little bit about our kind of prior work in this area, just to give you an idea of where the field is right now. So this work was funded by ONR. The goal of our work was to do real-time localization and dense mapping in wave conditions and shallow water environments, kind of challenging low texture areas where you might be, in a sandy environment where there aren't a lot of features to track. So visual navigation and dense mapping in these types of environments where there aren't a lot of visual features is really challenging because visual SLAM methods right now rely on having interesting features to track those features, match them across different viewpoints, and build a 3D model. So we were focusing specifically on this challenge of low texture environments. And we developed TurtleMap, which performs real-time localization and mapping for these textureless regions. So TurtleMap is a SLAM framework. So SLAM meaning the first component is localization. So estimating where our position is in the world. And then the second component is mapping. So once we have collected data, we have our estimated position. How do we build a dense map of the environment? We kind of decoupled these two processes. So our localization actually doesn't rely on visual information at all, because again, we're working in low texture environments. So it's visual tracking is really unreliable. And we instead formulated our localization stack to just rely on DVL, which is Doppler velocity log, provides seabed relative velocity. We also have an IMU, and then we also have a barometer, which is really low cost, but it actually helps a lot. So that's a simple one to integrate and can have a really big impact on results. So our localization fully relies on these three sensors. We output an estimate of our current position and orientation. And then we're using an out-of-the-box software called VoxBlocks to perform 3D reconstruction. So we have a Z camera, which is a very low-cost camera you can buy off the shelf. It's a stereo camera. They do have some automated processing to compute dense depth point clouds. So this is from the Z camera. I don't have it in these slides, but one thing that we did have to do was calibrate the camera really precisely underwater, right? So if you're interested in this, feel free to reach out to me and I can detail more about that process because the calibration is very important. But once we have the calibrated depth camera and our estimate of our location, then we can use Vox blocks to get a really nice dense map of our environment. Here we go. So here's an example of our robot running. I believe this video is 2x speed, but we're able to compute the map online. So you can see we're estimating our trajectory in green. The beams that are going downward are the 4 DVL beams. And then I believe we also have a 1D ping sonar as well. So this isn't a pool environment at University of Iowa. They actually have a really large wave tank. It's like probably 3 times, probably more than that, times the width of MHL. And they have underwater motion capture, which is really great because we get ground truth location of our vehicle. We also put a fake rock in the scene. You kind of see it over here. I'll show a closer view. But what we're looking for here is we know we're in a pool environment. We know it should be flat, right? So we want to see that our map is generally flat. And then they have this logo on the bottom, and we want to see that when we cross over the same path that it stays relatively consistent. So this is just kind of an overview of our results, and you can see that on the left is a log where we don't have the wave generator turned on, and we get a nice flat map. You can see our rock feature that we put in the water there, so we can, in general, construct coarse reconstructions of smaller features. And they also have an artificial beach that starts at the front of the tank and drops off. So we were able to reconstruct that change in depth as well. The right-hand log is a log from one of the wave conditions. We really are mainly impacted by waves if we're close to the surface. There's some impact on the acoustics. And there's also, just more movement of the vehicle itself. So we are prone to localization errors, but we still are able to get a relatively consistent map. So you can see the logo is well reconstructed, but a little bit noisier on the surface reconstruction.
Question.
Yeah.
What does that code do? Like, what does it take as input and what does it
Sure.
predict?
This code?
Oh, the whole thing.
Yep. Yeah. So it takes in DVL, IMU barometer, and the Z is a stereo camera. And it is outputting the 3D map, and it's outputting the green trajectory of the robot. Yeah. So this was kind of a nice demonstration that we could do real-time dense mapping in underwater environments of textureless regions, so challenging application. So like I said, this summer, we're going to go to Thunder Bay and test this over shipwreck sites and see how well it does, where we need to make improvements. I'm sure there will be some interesting research questions that come out of that too. So I just wanted to plug also coming soon. We have in robotics now been developing the marine autonomy research testbed. So this came out of an ONR DERF that was collaborative between faculty in robotics and NAME and in EECS. So it's meant to be a shared testbed here on North Campus. It's about 10 feet by 17 feet in size and 6.5 feet tall. So the water will be about 6 feet deep. And we have one nice little window we can look in. But the main technical feature really is that we'll have above water and underwater motion capture. So this will be a really nice resource. I'm most excited about it for robotics applications. Of course, we'll have ground truth localization in the tank. So that will allow us to get really nice evaluations on the methods we're developing for 3D reconstruction and localization. But we hope there will be many other use cases for this tank. So just wanted to put this out there. We are hoping to have it filled this summer. Good timing. So yeah, feel free to follow up if you are interested, if you have any kind of use cases for the tank. We should have kind of like a shared scheduling system in the fall for it. So that's kind of a summary of our work that we're doing in the field robotics group. So just what I talked about today, we developed machine learning methods for shipwreck detection from sonar imagery. We also used or took those detections and fed them to a robot to perform autonomous imaging surveys for 3D reconstruction. And we're now currently focused on real-time dense mapping to kind of close the loop on that whole pipeline for marine archaeologists for this case. We have the data set that I talked about available, and then also the code for the turtle map localization and mapping framework is available as well. And I just like to thank all of the scientists at Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. Fieldwork is a very collaborative effort. Also my collaborators at Michigan Tech and LSU. They are the ones who really help all of this work come to fruition. But I think we have a little bit of time for questions, so happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Oh, back of the room, yeah.
So you mentioned that when you took the stereo images, there was no picture, right?
Yes.
Do you have any trouble trying to estimate the disparity between the two cameras if the picture was not?
Yeah, so I'll say that was kind of a test here. I hadn't worked with these Z cameras before. So again, these are pretty low cost stereo cameras. They're now becoming widely used for, small mobile robotics applications. But I was pretty impressed with how well they worked underwater, computing the depth point. So, this is an example of the rock, but even in flat areas that didn't have good texture, there was a nice, reconstruction of that local point cloud. I don't know what they're doing under the hood. So we're not really sure. I think it's a proprietary algorithm that they have. But yeah, once we calibrated the cameras, pretty nice results for at least that local area.
The algorithm was not a computer.
Correct. This depth point cloud is from the camera manufacturers. Yeah. So it's part of their provided software when you buy the camera.
All the data collection is here is a freshwater body, right? So what are the implications in sea water? Like how does it affect the sonar data sets and the imaging data sets that you collect?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So we haven't investigated changes in water type. I'll also say one of the biggest impacts in environmental conditions is actually temperature. So when you go through thermoclines, it can lead to distortions, angular changes in the acoustic beam that's being sent out. So that can lead to distortions in the image. We did all of this testing in late May, early June in Lake Huron. So it's very cold. So we actually chose that test time to limit the impact of thermoclines. But yeah, I think testing this in the wider range of water bodies at different depths where you might see, different salinity, different temperature changes would be really interesting.
Curious about the challenges associated with real-time hardware or throttling the amount of data.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, we did some work on for this work, mainly time sync for the DVL, IMU, and barometer. So we have a pre-integration step to better align the measurements. That can be a challenge. I think that was probably the main challenge here because again, we're using VoxBlocks, which is a real-time dense mapping framework. But some of the challenges that we expect to have are in deploying, especially machine learning models on board the vehicles, just memory constraints on board. So yeah, these are some things that we're thinking about, and we'll have to come up with solutions for when we move, especially from the offline machine learning methods to onboard machine learning methods. Yeah.
You spoke about a deformation where you check to see what it looks like. Yeah, that's all really interesting. Can you say a little bit more backwards and why?
Yeah, so this was our proxy task for our machine learning method. If I can get to it. In our simulated data, I think you can kind of see it here. We broke up the shipwreck. So this one has maybe 3 or 4 parts. And that was to kind of simulate having fractured pieces of the ship. What this deformation branch is doing is it's learning to find those pieces and put them back together. We don't really care about that task in general. We're not trying to, recover shipwrecks from their wreck sites. But what it does is it forces the network to focus on those on those features, right? Like in order for the network to figure out how to take those pieces and put them back together, it needs to know a lot about what those features look like, how they fit together. And that just helps, essentially helps the network learn like what features to pay attention to. And in this case, that makes it pay attention to features that are characteristic of shipwreck sites. So it can just give it a little bit more of a cue.
So it's like solving, trying to do a jigsaw, like
Exactly.
problem to develop a correlation.
Yes. Yeah.
That they came from. the same.
Yeah, exactly. In computer vision, there's a common one to do kind of like a jigsaw where you shuffle different parts of the image and the network has to put them back together. So that's another kind of prior proxy task that's been shown to help the network learn something like image classification. So it's not the task that we care about, but it can help force the network to learn more about the task you care about.
Can I ask one? How do you parameterize? How do you parameterize things like size and properties? Do you do it in non-dimensional terms? Or I was thinking is like if you trained it on using a small,
Mhm.
then you want to apply it to something that is at scale display. How do you?
Do you mean how do you learn like
How do you
shipwrecks at
train
different
your model?
scales?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
Yes.
something we're looking at now. So we have kind of a follow-up work looking at multi-beam data. And multi-beam data is largely collected from the surface. So we have this problem because the wreck sizes can look very different because the depths are now really different depths depending on the survey heights and the resolution of the sensor, right? So yeah, this is something we're actually looking into now because if you train on examples where all the ships look to be the same scale in the image and pixel space, then you're going to have a problem trying to test on data that looks different. So yeah, one thing that we found to help is doing like kind of traditional augmentations like random scaling of the images, random cropping. But yeah, this is definitely a challenge for this type of application. I would say in general, we're at pretty consistent heights from the objects. There isn't a huge variation in how they appear because we're sending the robot down to collect the data. So there's a little less variation than like if you're doing deep ocean surveys, where you can have just a really wide range of depths.
Follow-up question on sort of will you ever consider the optimal depths? So like if your surface is closer to the surface to be able to you don't need to really like navigate as long distance versus if you are really close to the surface.
Yeah, so when we carried out these surveys, we tried to treat it as like if you were going to do a large area survey, what height from the bottom would you be, right? Not necessarily like, oh, we know the shipwreck is here and we want to be really close to it, right? We tried to have a good like variety of heights, but also just generally have the philosophy that, okay, this is a survey where we're looking for shipwrecks, even though we know where they are, right? So I wouldn't say we focus as much on what is the optimal height to be for detecting shipwrecks or for carrying out large area surveys. What we mainly looked at, or what we mainly were constrained by, was like what the actual water depth was. So shallow sites, we maybe are very close to the surface because we just don't have a lot of space to capture the image. With the deeper water sites, where we're usually probably about 20 meters off the bottom. But we tried to keep kind of a consistent height when we had the space to what we would be doing for a large area survey. So yeah, it was hard to not go back and get the best possible sonar images of every site to do the detection, right? Because we wanted to focus more on variety and going to as many sites as possible. But yeah, I think that would be really interesting. It'd be interesting if you could use our data to figure that out too, right?
A question about this approach. I was wondering, is it necessary to use real terrain image? Why not just make them as well as synthetic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know that we tested it with simulated terrain. I would say the simulated terrain, like I know Blender has like a generative terrain model, but it mainly varies like elevations. So the appearance may not look realistic. But yeah, I think there's probably a lot of potential now with like generative AI methods to probably make synthetic realistic terrain, with seeing only a few examples of real terrain. So that would be really interesting. Yeah. Our idea was more like if you see a lot of examples of real terrain, we're really just looking for something that looks different from the real terrain. So yeah, it was helpful for it to see the real terrain.
Any question? Would like kicked up still mess with the
Yeah, definitely messes with the cameras. Even when we do image restoration, we aren't really modeling that at all. It's a problem for like ROV missions where they're doing like sediment sampling on the bottom because sometimes they might hit the bottom and kick up sediment. So usually they kind of like wait for it to settle again. So yeah, we're not getting close enough to kick up sediment, at least in these cases, but definitely is a problem if we do. Yeah.
what if like a fish like, swam by? And,
Yeah, definitely. Other things in the environment. Yeah. Or sometimes even the thrusters, I bet, could have an impact.
Zero problem if the ship really blends into the environment over the years and creates its own system.
Yeah, that was like that. Oh, well, I've heard like zebra mussels can be a problem because it kind of changes how the shipwreck looks in the sonar image because it's now a different material that's sitting on top of the ship. So yeah, I think that's interesting. One thing I would be interested definitely is in change detection over time. Because this Thunder Bay, has a lot of history of data. They, do have probably useful data sets for looking at that as well.
The example of the underwater scanning terrain, the resolution, is it limited by the camera? Here's what I was thinking. Is it possible, is it even conceivable to think of, you have a biofouled hull, then you have a robot, one of your robot just kind of slowly goes around and that maps and then comes back with some kind of topology of the roughness of the thing. Is that
Oh, yes. There's a big market for ship hull inspection with robots. They typically use imaging sonar. So actually there was a large research project here by Ryan Eustace when he was in the Navy Department. He had a ship hull inspection project. So they're mainly using cameras and also imaging sonar, which is like a close range sonar.
I see.
Yeah.
And so it provides some sort of
Yeah, the goal is to have, you need to estimate the robot's position on the hull while you're mapping the hull. But the goal is to have like a map of the hull and that way, and also a way to detect features that are degraded over time, right? So I think that project went back several years in a row to try to see changes as well. Yeah. But there is also just a large market for hull inspection, autonomous robots. Yeah.
So how long does it take for you to scan site, say this?
So it really depends. One thing that we noticed with the autonomous vehicles when we were doing like the close range imaging surveys, it takes a lot of energy. So because it's constantly trying to like stay on its trajectory and adjust its trajectory, it really requires a lot of battery power. So I would say where those vehicles, we could get like 4 hours of running with an ROV pilot where you're not having the thruster on all the time. With the autonomy, we really maybe got like 30 minutes. So that's, I think, one area where research is needed to make like energy efficient surveying. Yeah. So we maybe didn't even cover the whole survey, the whole site. The Monahans site's not very large, but like the chicken barge that I showed, barge number 1, that's a very large site, so we could only do a portion of it.
I was being very naive. I thought maybe you would send one of your things and try to find plane wrecks.
Oh, the IVers that we use for these side scan sonar ones where we're not capturing imagery. Well, they can capture images too. These vehicles, we can go kilometers. Yeah, we can run for 8 hours at a time. I think the longest run we did was like 2 kilometers out. So yeah, these can go very far.
And they stay on surface.
Nope, they dive underwater as well. Yeah, so these vehicles can go 100 meters deep. But yeah, there are, of course, newer, better vehicles now that can go much farther. Yeah, so the 30-minute thing was the ROVs that we're using to do the imaging surveys. Yeah, that are more detailed.
I have a follow-up question. So to do the survey, so how does it affect, like, if you have a group of small AUVs instead of, one good one, like you're doing the survey, or a group of UAVs but with lower quality, would that help?
Yep. Yeah, that's a big area of research right now too. So both multi-vehicle, but also moving towards low-cost AUVs so that you could have multiple vehicles in the water. And one big challenge is communication, right? So the bandwidth, we're using acoustics for communication, and the bandwidth is pretty limited. So a big part of the research problem there is doing this low bandwidth communication.
There aren't any questions. Brings the seminar to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.